Hello everyone, today we talk about the foot soldier's battle psychology. I made last year two quite fortunate videos about the knightly combat psychology, which is not necessarily just the mounted one, but say par excellence in the most functional use it is. There will be, in fact, much to discuss about this, including the ups and downs that strength ratio between cavalry and infantry had in historical times. I don't like to brag too much, but Schwerpunkt is truly at this point the only channel on YouTube that has actually discussed this from any sort of relevant historical standpoint. You can run a simple search like all you find is something like how would you survive on a medieval battlefield, or look at how this armor works or whatever. Nobody really talks about the single most important thing about battles. Like, people are interested at also at other levels of strategic history. There is an art of war, but obviously, as we know, Clausewitzianly speaking, the two levels of tactics and strategy collimate, and even as they're unfolding, they are always overlapping with one another in different ways. So if you're not familiar with the Clausewitzian theory, if for you talking about military history is leaving comments on HEMA channels or whatever, like, perhaps you'll be a bit disoriented in learning what we actually do, where it matters, so to say. Nevertheless, I think I never made such bold externation just right off the bat. As you know, I'm not really it's not like I'm not modest. As I said before, I usually don't brag at all, nor I care very much about this. But at this point of Schwerpunkt history, we have the material for having people understand this is something more systemic, something more organic that at this point there is no excuse to ignore. As you know, on this channel we also cover the entirety of sort of the art of war. We don't stop just to the Middle Ages. I happen to be specialized in battle reconstruction, mostly, not only, but primarily in my publishing, in my research, and so on. So this is a topic that I partially wrote also my doctoral thesis on, partially because, and I never really told you much about what the whole subject was, but there is indeed in the analysis of the various arms interaction like pretty much the key to understanding the whole art of war of the period. Today we will take sort of a broader look at this matter. And why psychology? By the way, this is actually the key word here. And it is indeed, speaking of moral forces, Clausewitzianly speaking, really, this may be the single most important aspect, right? Warfare is not much a matter of technology. It is primarily a matter of moral forces, right? And sort of collective training, leadership, morale. Arms and armor really come last in all of this. Besides, at the time, we're looking at armies that were fundamentally equipped in the same way. Really, there isn't any meaningful difference, especially today. We will stop to basically the heart of the Middle Ages in Western Europe and whereabouts, right, primarily Western Europe. Now, if you're interested, of course, if these are the first videos you watch from, just know that literally everything you can possibly look at this from in perspective in terms of single historical unit types. I have an entire playlist dedicated to infantry warfare. I have battle reconstruction based on primary sources, like the entire video being about the handling of the same evidence. I have armies organization. I have entire tactics videos and tactic playlists. So there are no excuses even here to say, but wait a minute, whatever. First, look at what I made. Then I'm not here to discuss really much of the matter if I already did that. In any case, meaning with you, really, I didn't want to add it in the sense that, yeah, I'm here to discuss with you. There is a Q&A series and whatever, but if, say, I already made several tens of videos, multiple hours long each on a given topic, and you come here and you say your own thing, and it has no fundamentals, do not expect any answer, if not some Q&A sort of dismantling the psychological reason why people say certain things from a historical point of view. No, I'm not referring to the recent Q&A about the Lombard League, Frederick II, but it's important because I really sort of expect a level of maturity from my followers. Naturally, it's not warranted per se, but that I've learned having actually being growing, consolidating, in fact, especially as this channel spread, people sort of understood what this is all about. Now, there are different ways one can approach this, because naturally understanding the psychology of somebody fighting in the 13th century is something rather complicated, even from a strict heuristic or methodological point of view, right? We don't claim to know, but naturally we have many different indicators, and generally speaking, some not just process of analogy, of comparison, but definitely a lot of sort of military logical evidence that makes us that shows through the same primary, through the same sources of the time, and that really leaves not much of a doubt about this. What I always say in this video is that we have some pretty paradoxically, we know better how armies of the time fundamentally worked, with the due exceptions and not necessarily the fringe ones. If anything, you would be surprised by how it is the contrary, and I will explain why. So that there's not much of a greater mystery, right, of how this whole thing went down, how, armies fought by scale, etc. Paradoxically, it's in fact the comparative diachronic analysis that is missing. People tend to overly specialize in a given time and place and ignore pretty much everything else, right, including the other eras, as a matter of fact. And paradoxically, in fact, the bigger the system is, so actually the more advanced the armies are, the more difficult it becomes even for scholars to stay correct, to be particularly insightful. I'm trying to do something, and probably in a few years, if I continue like this, probably we will count to your ears and eyes, probably in the public sort of arena of academic debate, because I think that I came up with pretty interesting stuff that people at the top are actually pretty interested in. When I say the top, I mean literally say those who had dominated this field, mostly the Anglo-American historiography at this point, even though from the 1970s, it's not like things were particularly glorious. There's just like in continental Europe, we didn't write enough military history, also because of World War II and everything, but we're trying to catch up, right? Now, one, again, can approach this psychological aspect from different standpoints. The utility of the combat mindset among infantrymen stemmed in a very strong part from their service in dense formations, right? This is something that actually we can say for knights as well. Instinctively, men in dangerous situations tend to feel more comfort at remaining within the mass, right? They can back each other better, like the notion that some sort of culturalist proposed that basically just having a unit, maybe, 300 meters away that is just about to enter to the fray is reassuring in the same way it's false, right? Unit cohesion is something so deeply inherent. There is on that of battle formations, of the entire sort of tactical development. It's impossible not to look at this in battles, and probably not to perceive it in a way, right? There are all the most obvious moral, political, cultural reasons, and even just the sheer evenemential, historical, strategic ones for which people goes to war, and so why these people took the field, which for infantry, given that we're talking about the heart of the Middle Ages, is not this great fest per se. There is definitely a sociocultural divide that actually has these estates relegated in a condition of, in fact, moral and material inferiority by knights, by the feudal establishment in particular. My recent videos about the Lombard League, both the one against Frederick Barbarossa and Frederick II, actually speak of how sort of inspiring that contest had been, because even though the Italians never had their own infantry victories, they had fully organic armies that always maintained, actually increased the cooperation between cavalry and infantry. Actually, these wars of the Lombard League is the peak of sort of infantry autonomy there, and they would have still the best infantries out there. There were other countries that indeed ended up, especially in some fringe areas, to to rely pretty consistently on infantry, and even to go so apparently foolishly, as it was considered at the time, before these forces actually won very important battles alone against cavalry. Right? We're looking notoriously, they're actually an exception. Like these battles have been presented sometimes in a positivistic and deterministic sense, like, oh, well, this is the end of mounted warfare, the crisis. There is something to it in a broader civilizational sense, but military speaking, right? If you look at Scotland, the Ditmarscher, the Swiss, the Flemish, at the beginning of the 14th century, the reason why they broke out, like for a while, by the way, because look at the Flemish, they were brutally resubjugated by the most feudal forces that you can imagine, namely the ones of the Dukes of Burgundy throughout all the rest of the Middle Ages. And those were actually the more developed infantry armies of the story. The Swiss exploited their terrain, their decentralized. Essentially, these were all fundamentally decentralized countries. In fact, and by the mid-14th century, infantry has gone down again, with the only exception of England, that, however, is a non-exception, first of all, because there were royal armies, differently from these other ones of peasants and of burghers, and that basically dismounted, as also other knightly armies dismounted at a point. So infantry doesn't mean just the people, all right? It can mean, in fact, the men-at-arms themselves. And so if you're a long date follower, you're pretty much acquainted with how this system works. But the more I go on, the more I realize that we live in a world in which the wide majority of people has absolutely not even a clue about this. Like, they truly reason, okay, in a very confused blob vision of the Middle Ages to begin with, but even those who sort of care or seem to care and have a material ambition, etc., they often simply neglect. They don't have any idea that it's even a thing, right? And instead, it's one of the basically the core of this relation between cavalry and infantry in the Middle Ages. Now, mass deployment, I could digress for this for 72 hours in a row, right? But physical limits excluded from the equation, but that's also why I make so many videos about these topics to begin with. So mass deployment alone generated this collective assurance through the physical proximity of bodies, locked shield to shield or pike to pike, or both, by the way, because one of the single most underrated aspects in medieval warfare is, but with a pike you can't use a shield. Yes, you can, actually. Not even just a small one, like just the other day we've seen the Seleucid Sariosophora, but literally few people know that pavises, for example, were actually used even with a pike at both ends. And this is something that scholarship seems to have difficulties to grasp, because essentially they also stereotypically tend to look just at certain specific armies of the very later Middle Ages, and they think that the pavis to be just either something gigantic or fixed and mobile. Well, the only thing that actually indicates what a pavis is, it's stratification and construction, as opposed to actual size or shape. Shape a little bit more, but in fact in a much more varied fashion than we think, including size. But this is the point, pretty thickly locked in, especially immobile ranks. This is what infantry, again, today we will look also at the whole board of, will not arrive to the later Swiss, I think. So there is no chance of sort of equivocating that we're talking about infantry that against cavalry can't but be a defensive one, right? Naturally, heavy infantry can sort of fence off and even clear the field from lighter cavalry. You have, again, missile infantry, light infantry do not knock anything heavy by definition. Actually, they don't knock anybody out, if not maybe their correspondent forces that usually, however, was considered some sort of waste of ammo, and or technically the major function of missile troops was to target the enemy lines from the rear, or from the heights. Like, this depends on the battlefield and how the battle unfolds. Naturally, there is some symmetry in all this, as we said before. Infantry can obviously advance, and it actually reaches peaks of very high levels of collective training and coordination. It's not like cavalry was fighting and infantry was sitting there watching, all right? If you look at the Italian armies of the late 13th to the early 14th century, you realize that there were wings of 5,000 men. I meaning that in a single way that advanced in parallel with their own cavalry battle line. That was considered the battle line alone, just for telling you how auxiliary technically infantry was considered in the Middle Ages, even in the most advanced context. 5,000 per wing means a larger army than the ones that the Swiss mobilized in the second half of the 15th century. Right, so we're talking about staggering levels of military civilizational advancement that notoriously, in fact, would not be met by the Renaissance. The Renaissance had armies that barely arrived to the levels of the ones of the great actual peak of medieval civilization that is in the late 13th, early 14th century, and that people do not have much of a familiarity with, because again, not all parts of Europe fought for the same intensity. There were more or less wars here and there. There are also some countries, for example, didn't fight against one another. Right? It's not like we have a case of, I don't know, let's test how the Polish army fared against the Spanish one. Right? There are some countries never get invaded, or others that, in any case, mostly have, say, composite forces, or coalition forces from different, otherwise, in fact, pretty different, pretty multinational forces. This was really normal, especially in Western Europe, but not only. So this is the point. You have to sit there and take a cavalry charge, right? You can outflank them if you have managed to crush the enemy wing in front of infantry wing in front of you. You can fall on the flank. At that point, you can also break formation. These infantrymen were absolutely trained to march in good order, advance, whatever. We've seen in battles like Carcano that in that case the Lombards were crushed by German cavalry. Then that proceeded to attack the Lombard cavalry, and the infantry regrouped and stormed the German Ghibelline camp. So this is somehow, I can't say unique, but it's also difficult to find a parallel to this. So I also made various videos about infantry autonomy under that name. You can search the videos that I specifically made on the subject, right? But normally when you were to confront cavalry, which it's not even entirely clear at certain, even especially at the peak of medieval warfare. So in the sense at the peak of cavalry strength and infantry strength, how this would normally happen, because the most advanced armies were also symmetric, and so tendentially infantry actually did combat other infantry, but at the same time we don't know much about it to begin with. There could be important asymmetries, like, I don't know, very finely trained crossbowmen positioned on some heights that managed to shatter a pike block, whatever. Pikes, by the way, were there, right? The pike block may be excessive as a term, meaning that not even the Swiss at some point used only pikes, or even during the Renaissance, infantry formations were exclusively of pikemen. But indeed, the front ranks, and probably more, depending on which forces we're talking about, were at some point, in some cases, at least the first ranks always, right, constituted by pikes, because the point of it all is that not just the pike always existed since prehistory, but there's literally no other way to stop cavalry but with pikes, right? You can use some combination of heavy infantry and missile forces, but fundamentally, as we said before, missile forces are auxiliary, in this case compared to heavy infantry. And so what actually stops cavalry quite physically is this hedgehog formation of pikes, right? And this is true for any other formation, by the way. The idea that the shield wall was kind of tactical function per se, other than protecting yourself from blows, right? It's not really a thing, right? The offensiveness of it all was always, in fact, offensive or counter-offensive. As infantry, at some point, as von Clausewitz explained, you don't defend just to defend. At some point, you have to pass through a counterattack as well, which also happened when the enemy was shattered. So it's never about the weapons. Cavalry routinely had always charged into pikes. It had nothing to do about what kind of weapon was used. Like, there can be more functionalization within a unit, but in general, like, knights were trained to charge into pikes, because they could have not, hopefully they would, I don't know, catch these formations in the open, attack them as they were still in column or from the side, whatever, but otherwise it was more normal. You charged into, first of all, other cavalry, admittedly, but if you found determined infantry that stood their ground, you charged straight into that, right? You would have to test here and there which part of the line was sort of better to crush. At the Battle of Bannockburn, you have the English knights circling around the Scottish, in fact, round formations with the pikes on the outer side on the wall perimeter, and lots of the rabble that moved literally in parallel at the same level, at the same point of the circle that the knights were walking along, to counter any possible charge there from the posterior ranks, because normally knights in fact broke through, right? And so if you didn't have enough troops behind to sort of absorb the hit, as cavalry was slowing down, which is by far the most dangerous moment for cavalry in combat, so to break through, but not to break completely everything, right? Then they remain there. They lost their cavalry cannot defend by definition, and so there are lots of troops not with pikes, but with, say, bludgeoning weapons, axes, whatever you name them, that will start taking those guys down, right? If you look at the Battle of Kortrijk, for example, great victory of infantry, perhaps the most impacting for different reasons. This is debatable and sort of in a broader historical, moral, political sense, but indeed they are the French, right, that are always, or often at least, misportrayed. They were idiots that didn't know how new warfare worked. But from the other side, the Flemish were trained by knights, were commanded by knights. Like, the infantry was not capable of doing this alone. It was all a product of the feudal establishment, and that had rebelled in that case in Flanders. And if anything, the troops that knew best how to use infantry were exactly the knights throughout all the Middle Ages, throughout any other era. There was literally never an exception to this whatsoever. Well, at Kortrijk, the French actually broke through the Flemish formation entirely. And notoriously, they lost because there was a reserve that, in fact, had been intelligently deployed by the Counts of Flanders in the rear of that formation, which means that the French had charged frontally through a ditch. They literally crossed, they dismounted, they remounted, they relined up, and they charged. Right, meaning that the Flemish didn't even attack them while they were crossing the ditch, for telling you how scary cavalry was, just for telling you. By the way, the Flemish, again, as I said before, got beaten repeatedly. They have just Moulin-Pavel, that is a sort of draw, and then until Guinegate, throughout the entire 2 centuries afterward, they never win. They're routinely beaten with the same type of army from both sides in the same identical way. It's something utterly insane. I don't know any other series of this in medieval warfare, or also in any other context, telling the truth, for telling you that this great superiority of infantry, this progress, the sort of positivistic, technologistic, it's all a pile of garbage, just as much as the entire history of the military revolution and all these nonsense that was used just to sell books and chop up some more tree in the process. Now, the typical numerical superiority of infantry is also a deal. When you fixate on weaponry, for example, does it make sense to the degree that, of course, if you look also at the longbowmen in later time, there were actually a lot of them, right? As we said before, longbowmen never stopped any cavalry charge whatsoever, right? It was always in combination with the heavies that stopped the charge. As a matter of fact, those were other supportive weapons. But say, in order to do so, you also need a lot of men, right, which also costs a lot. And so also from a social point of view, aside from the fact that you have to arm a lot of commoners that may be eventually that can become sort of pretty embittered veterans, they can sort of issue some important social instances of revolt, say negotiation of their rights, whatever. All this stuff is a problem, but fielding really a lot of men, it's something very costly. In fact, if you look, as I also was saying before, if you look at what the Swiss do, meaning armies of entirely of pikemen, or at least prevalently pikemen, by the mid-15th century, before that there was literally nothing peculiar about the Swiss. They fought even as they won as infantrymen, just like all the others, right? And they were just, again, not properly field armies compared to the feudal Habsburgic ones, for example. By the mid-15th century, by being beaten, by the way, by these mounted knights in the famous Battle of Orbedo, by the Milanese knights of Carmagnola that outranged them with their weapons, that apparently was a thing, was a factor, if anything, they decide to increase the length, actually the proportion of the number of pikemen, the ratio, quota of pikemen in their forces, at the detriment of the halberd that remain anyway. And so this requires a great deal of training. It requires a great deal of a reason to do so, right? And these guys were eager to conquer other people's land. This is something similar to what happened to many other successful military systems. But there were small armies. We said it before. Like if you look at the Swiss armies of that period, the heyday of their until the very beginning of the 16th century, it's just basically not even a couple of generations, right, of continued warfare. They were small infantry force. Of course, in between there had been the big crisis of the late Middle Ages, the one of the mid 14th century, the Black Death, and so on. So obviously also demographic sources were what they were, etc. But the reason why certain countries, as also throughout most of early modern Europe, did not actually dominate, right, the battlefields of Europe, is that they didn't have enough core mass or say a societal organization to depute a large amount of men for military service, right? For example, the Italians were quite rich, and so they normally hired the typical heavier cavalry just on their own, but they did not want to arm their citizenry, both because this one did not want, they had, as we said before, actually participated with these enormous armies. I made an entire video about the early 14th century, count literally millions of men in arms. I'm not kidding. Just make the maths. Have all the video there with the entire sources of over 10,000 plus hosts in less than 2 generations fielded. At this point, they had gentrified. The source had struck. The great crisis of the 14th century struck. These rich Italian city-states had a pretty big part of the population involved in arts and crafts. So they were not soldiers by vocation. Equally, the French basically lose the Italian wars. One can see it in hindsight in this way, even though it could have gone differently. Fundamentally, because at least they would have had a massive edge in their favor had they armed large amount of trained infantrymen. The French are a hyper-aristocratic, hyper-monarchistic, of course, country. They do not want to do that because they feared revolution, which, in case you didn't notice, in France is something that routinely happened. Look at what had happened during the Jacquerie, during the same, in fact, mid-14th century crisis, what will happen with the wars of religion, what will happen with the Fronde, with the same French Revolution. Actually, the revolution were about to break out, right? During Louis XIV, there were at least 3 or 4 revolutions that were about to start. Also because of the military pressure, right? The cost, at least in society, of this. So a lot of stuff, if you want to study this from a politological, sociological standpoint, right? So in order to have enough infantry, you really needed to be quite determined. You had to fight for something like independence, leveraging in this sense also some decentralized position, because normally the battlefields of Western Europe were truly dominated in a quite concrete sense by cavalry, not just tactically, but strategically, logistically, politically, socially, to begin with. And so these experiments remained relatively rare. Right? Don't get me wrong, medieval armies had a lot of infantry, but a lot of it. But it had a complementary role, a combined armed auxiliary function, right? And there was no other way but to field them in that fashion. In fact, what happens during the mid-14th century crisis is that when the Black Death strikes, it's not much that lots of people have died, and so obviously striking more easily also the people who had the lowest military defenses. It's mostly exactly the Third Estate, the Fourth Estate in particular. But there is primarily a psychological collapse. And people do not want to fight. This had happened also in other times. It had happened during the Migration era. It had happened during the post-Carolingian era. The commoners do not actually lose their aptness to arm. There is always some militia system, whatever, but they depute warfare to somebody else. Like they want smaller armies, but by more professional troops. And in fact, you find knights, pavisiers, crossbowmen, pikemen, but the broader mass of commoners of sort of pretty heterogeneous extraction and equipment and so on, even though in the later, before the crisis, states, monarchies, etc., had started truly equipping these guys by themselves, which is an incredibly underrated aspect, right? It sounds a very classical style thing, and this did actually happen during the Middle Ages. The situation changes, right? Drastically with the crisis. There are different proportions. One can have fun, let's say, calculating it. I did it. I wrote something almost 200 pages about that sometimes, right? And it depends. Like there is this idea that the ideal classical canonic proportion is 1 to 10. speaking, especially mounted nobility, foot soldiers, which is not really some real divide, because again the most important divide is social, and also among cavalry there were lots of, so most men were not the nobility as such. In particular, the aristocracy was something looser, but let's say also the footmen are different figures, right? So it's mostly about their quality, right? Something closer to this 1 to 10 was especially said for the Italian communes, because again there is more citizenry participation, they are more close-knit group. They have truly also statile capacity to sustain these larger forces, whatever, but cavalry was always dominant, as we said before, there too. What looks way more average throughout the Middle Ages, something like 1 to 5, which is already actually a pretty, especially in certain parts of Europe, the most feudalized ones, technically a pretty large amount of infantry, really. I will not digress on how feudal historiography tended not to discuss very much, again, the performance of infantry. If you look at the biggest battles of the 13th century, we're talking Benevent, Tagliacozzo, Markfeld, that are also practically non-existent in pop culture, but they're truly the single most important ones by size, and also at the time, politically and strategically. We do know from the many sources surrounding these battles overall that, of course, infantry was there on a regular basis in pretty large numbers, but when the battle accounts speak, they practically don't care at all about the infantry. Right? This is typical of that context, because we're talking very feudal realities, and so feudal sources do not care very much about this. But the feudal sources, they say, normally at the time were, I don't know, Franciscans, Dominicans, something like that. It doesn't mean the guy will leave that court. This is something more like from the very later Middle Ages. But of course, there is also a mentality that you want to grasp here that reflects the actual sort of vision of the battlefield, the vision of society, of the world, whatever. It's not directly proportional to the actual tactical proportions, numerical proportions of various arms, but it still says something very important about this mentality. And we tend to sort of probably underrate, from some standpoint, the superiority of cavalry combat because of who the cavalrymen were, right? If you start thinking that from a strictly physical standpoint of some standard sort of trooper, you say, well, okay, but you can actually stop cavalry, but you have no idea how the cavalrymen were trained. That's why I made the video about knightly combat psychology, because it gives you, and it's very pertinent to this topic, because it's fundamentally a complementary video, that knights were extermination machines. All right, the commoner that had gotten there, doesn't matter how well equipped, how motivated also in his own way, was just a guy that did not kill people for a living. All right, this is a radical neurocognitive difference, right? It's not much just that the nobility was normally tougher, better nourished. They were historically genetically selected from toughest people who literally, in fact, cut each other to pieces and other people on a regular basis for a living. So it means it was truly a massive epigenetic development of the nobility. There's absolutely no doubt about this. It's not like peasants were something like a peasant in the Middle Ages would be a guy who would down you quite easily, given the traumatic brutality in which he was constantly steeped, and it's something unspeakable. But truly, the psychology of holding it together as a broader formation, knowing what to do, it's just much less than anything that knights were, with their heavily armored, thickly packed, crocheted lance charge tactics. They were something utterly insane, right? So from a sheer psychological point of view, it's something utterly devastating, right? When they shot that movie Waterloo, it was a big international. You're talking in 1970, if I'm not wrong, with Rod Steiger. It's a beautiful movie, right? All true, no special effects, real people. Most of the this was, again, a truly international Western, Eastern, quote-unquote, bloc cooperation, because, of course, of the international meaning of the European-wide sort of relevance of Napoleonic warfare. And they brought, the Soviets brought a lot of troops on there. Literally, most of the soldiers are literally from the Warsaw Pact, at least I think. I think there were Soviet army in particular, but I'm not sure. There were other nationalities to shot the scenes, right? And when the French cavalry charges the British squares, even though that's all staged, that's a fake it's not a battle. It's just like a movie being shot. Like, you had people that were trained as mid 20th century records, soldiers, to literally go against tanks, right? To be under sort of air bombing, whatever. They could not stay put in front of that fake cavalry charge. It was not even going to smash inside. Right? The sheer psychological effect, or even just a frontal charge, something that it's so heavily traumatizing that people don't even conceive to understand. You think that being shell shocked is worse than that? It's not worse than that, right? It just people became weaker. First of all, historically, there is absolutely obviously the case that you go through traumas that are from your individual perspective, just out of the bad luck, kind of accidents, utterly more devastating, maybe the cavalry charges, no doubt, but the sheer psychological impact of having just this avalanche of horsemen running against you, like, would not make these troops stay aligned in the way they had been trained in a military, in a 20th century military, because of the sheer sort of disturbing effect of that sight, right? Imagine in the Middle Ages, in which this was happening also on a regular basis. What has always struck me, by the way, studying medieval battles, also in terms of organization during a campaign, whatever, is that you never find something like, okay, these guys, I don't know, blipped up at some point. Like, I don't know, this army did not fight. It may happen from a logistical point of view. There may be difficulties, whatever. But when you look at combat, nobody says, I don't know, this army did not know how to fight. These guys were bad or didn't know. Like, the continuity, the homogeneity of this warfare, like the fact that they fought practically all in the same way, and armies function all in the same way. They march all 30 kilometers a day. That was, in fact, there's no difference even with classical antiquity, also because everybody marches 30 kilometers a day throughout all history. It's something insane. They never failed at doing what they did. Which means that if you were a knight, you were the pinnacle of professional elite fighting force that really the entire world looked up to you. Essentially, in feudal countries in particular, the entire world, the entire system worked exclusively for you to be on top of that horse and charging into people at 45 kilometers per hour, right? Which is, if you think about it, insane, right? If you drive a motorcycle, you would never want to smash into anything at 45 kilometers per hour. So the reason why they did that, and this was not much, it was actually suicidal, right? First of all, think about charging 45 kilometers per hour against somebody else that charges at 45 kilometers per hour against you, which is exactly how cavalry regularly work. That's utterly insane. It's like smashing into something at 90 kilometers per hour. The confidence there is that you're going to smash who is in front of you, because their physical resistance will come less together with their will. It's always a psychological impact first. It's not much, warfare is not much about, how much people you butcher in terms of physical destruction. It ends up to be that, right? Klaus has explained that, but it's a primarily psychological issue, right? And this is also why all tactics, combat, for me, whatever, nobody cares about weapons in this account, right? It's completely, in the medieval mentality, it's practically the least relevant topic that comes up as a tertiary detail here and there, just if you search for it. The entire point is how the battle lines handled themselves. Who pushed the hardest, right? Who fought the bitterest. That's what matters. These people were chopping each other to pieces on a regular basis. This was their entire life, right? The entire purpose of medieval knight was to slaughter the largest amount of people as possible in combat. Right, the monastic military orders like the Templars, the only purpose for which they existed was to die after having massacred 30 people in hand-to-hand combat. Right, it's very easy, and in many ways, like to shoot at people, I don't know, at 200 meters, to bomb them, whatever. Everybody can do it. These people killed each other, chopping each other to pieces, right, disemboweling each other with their own hands, right? And the most important thing about combat in this sense is that it doesn't matter what you have in your hands to kill another person. What matters is how much you hate them, how much you can crush their skulls, how much you can turn them into pulp as they're shouting as dirty animals. That's what matters in combat. That's the single most important thing. The entire Catholic civilization, the entire universal imperial ideal all across the globe was exclusively based on the affirmation of leadership in this way, because naturally, of course, the world was fallen, and people thought, because they were imperfect, you had failed at convincing them with your own divinity that you were divine in this sense. But warfare was seen exactly as the catalyst for achieving divinity. All world religions have the sole identical purpose. There's no difference whatsoever, right? It's about time we start mandate in schools this core facts about ancient spirituality and how this whole thing. Why do you think that? They also basically talk about war. If you study a chronicle, it's not they were upset. Years ago there were these people that said, "Oh my God, people loved warfare in the Middle Ages. Oh my God, it's like it's a culturalist issue." Right? If you pose yourself this question, regardless of what your answer is, it means that you don't know absolutely anything about sort of the history of civilization in general, right? Thinking that the medievals were weird, right? Together with, I don't know, because they painted funny illuminations or something like that. That's how most people are acquainted with the Middle Ages. This has nothing to do with any historical evidence that we have at our hand. It's basically just a massive hallucination of radically underscored lesser people living in the 21st century. It has nothing to do with reality. And that's what we have gotten to, as a matter of fact. From this perspective, see it from the side of those who had the worst of this, normally, at least. Infantry. Infantry practically has a competitive edge with cavalry as a standalone arm until basically the mid-12th century. Talking Western Europe, paradoxically, I know, if you look at the certain fringes, say in Ireland, they had almost basically only infantry, and they obviously would fight like that. They could ambush the enemy. Yes, okay, but that's not because they were better at it. That's because they were worse at it, right? They couldn't bring bigger hosts in open field. If they did, they risked to be cut down by the Anglo-Normans. So that's not much of a merit. Guerrilla is not a merit, right? The history of the notion that, I don't know, the West does not win against guerrilla or whatever, it's a pile of manure that never ends under any strategic point of view. There are also pretty concrete indicators of this throughout military history. If people had a culture in such things, proving the same. But the idea is truly that infantry, and so I would like to stress this also from a personal point of view, we all descend from these people. All right, we all descend from knights. There is no doubt about this. We also descend, likely in a mathematical statistical sense, from some of the single most famous people of the era. There's not much of a doubt that we are likely descend from Charlemagne, right? As Western, as Europeans in particular, but you would be really surprised with how genes travel. The sense that that there is this mass of footmen that regularly goes at war like that, right? If as a European you think about where you come from, where you're more likely originating, like where your ancestors would have largely lived during the Middle Ages, you can look at literally at all these numbers, studying the history of the various towns, of the various principalities, and say, look at here, 3,000 footmen, 1,000 footmen, all these years, you understand that your ancestors were there, right, largely. So you can sympathize with them as well, and try in this sense to think how careful you would have to be with your life, even more in a way. Like, we are all hallucinated by the beauty of knights per se, and we should learn from that as well. That's why I didn't start with the knightly combat psychology of the other video because of this, but it was just the lottery extraction that brought that to be. But in general, like, we are more excited by that knightly perspective, right? But the footmen deserve this consideration. So you have to think, like, knights do that for a living, right? How much guts it takes to be from the other side, right? It gives you a dimension of just how much tougher our ancestors were than we were, right? And how cold your nerves had to be, because we do know that infantry played that role. Again, we don't find in sources, infantry had been brought on the field and it did not do anything. Very often times you find actually something like, I don't know, the cavalry had been broken by other cavalry, and the infantry maybe hoped for a more prolonged engagement, and they remained, by the way, at this point isolated, in the sense that you can also break formation, but at that point you will be more easily cut down. And some of them, even though knowing that infantry normally did not win, they understood that probably the best way to stay alive was to stand your ground. There are many occasions in which this is the case, and many random outcomes. We've seen, for example, the Battle of Bouvines, the Brabançons on the Anglo-German right that in many ways were boxed actually in the field, so they didn't have really too much where to escape. They were cut to pieces till the last one, and it took down with them. These were infantrymen, they were pikemen, right? And from this, tendentially Flemish communities that were to grow, importantly with some infantry warfare, as we were saying before as well. These were mercenaries, by the way, so they were better than the burghers, but in many ways they could have originated from the same background. Just their lifestyle was different. We've seen recently in the video about the Second Lombard League, also in the first one for that matter, the Lombards of Legnano, the Lombards of Cortenois. These guys stood their ground basically to win or die, right? And they knew that alone they would have died, right? The ones at Legnano had been abandoned by their own cavalry, and some new cavalry returned that had partly rallied the fleeing one, and they attacked the Imperials from the flank. Why that Ghibelline cavalry was in fact charging the Lombards, this Milanese in particular, from the front, right? So these footmen were resisting. I've seen at Cortenois, basically it's the sunset that saves them, but for the whole afternoon, basically they had been taking the heavy cavalry charges of, by the way, Frederick II's feudal knights, which is not exactly like between Germans and Sicilians and also Italian Ghibellines, like some bad cavalry, to say the least. It's the peak of mounted warfare together with the French and other nations. Let's say it's a big deal, right? As tough as infantry, normally as tough as cavalry, normally, right? There were societal reasons, as we said before, like, for example, for the Flemish in the early 14th century, there was a broader social revolt, right, for which the town folks were mostly infantrymen. They didn't have much cavalry. You had the Counts of Flanders with them, but most of the nobility had actually sided with the French and/or was not there. There wasn't properly a cavalry arm. They fought on foot in that circumstance. There are all kinds of situations where you find this stubborn last stands, as a matter of fact. And so you never hear, like, infantry arrived there and fled for no reason, right? They always were expected to fight. Otherwise, it would have not made sense for them to exist. Like, warfare would have developed in a completely different way. This directly molded their psychological outlook by learning that also, yes, sheer weight of numbers and interlocking weapons could neutralize the individual prowess of the armored horsemen. If they found themselves in that circumstance, in any case, for most of this period, was not, in fact, contemplated. In fact, after the mid-12th century until the early 14th, cavalry dominates. In Western Europe, there is no infantry that wins. You can find infantry, as we just expressed, that actually, even six confrontation with cavalry, crazily enough, the only exception I know is, as we've seen, the Bolognese at Fossalta. Literally, they don't even wait for their cavalry. They cross a river and they go alone against enemy cavalry and infantry together. And they even make it out of there. There are other battles where they will see partially soon in which, I don't know, in the German Middle Ages, there are, like, at the beginning of the 13th century, it was some important, especially in the northwest, even close to Flanders, in some social-cultural sense, from a military standpoint, like these infantries that are important, they are angry, they outflank the enemy, whatever. So there are the signals, mixed signals here and there that show how sort of strong actually infantry was all across, even though they were subordinated to cavalry at this point in history. I don't know how much we're probably this video I'm going to make in different chunks because there is so much here to tell. Downing a horseman was a huge deal from a ideal and moral standpoint. I mean, there are situations in which, I don't know, angry peasants catch a single knight out there in the open and they cut him down. Like, there are these, you understand the hatred there. There are revolts, there I've seen the Jacquerie, there is a hatred against knights at some point. You can imagine, like today, like imagine that there is a forte estate that is subjugated into some sort of semi-servile condition, and they are meant to be down. There is an entire, let's say, ideological and symbolic cathedral that is meant to keep people restrained in this way for the functional development of society, which definitely does develop in this way. There is a sense of contractual negotiation. Peasants had not really gone under because they had been quote unquote oppressed per se, but mostly medieval peasantry was much free, especially in this high medieval times, much actually freer and with greater liberty than they would have in the later Middle Ages and in the modern age, right? And this meant actually that they had their own rural communes, they had their own levies. They were often also equipped by this or that power for going to war, so that there were profound connections with all the institutions. Definitely Middle Ages do not show us a classist, or any other time in history for that matter, the scientific validity of any classist interpretation of history. On the contrary, I made videos also explaining how this mechanism worked. There is an entire playlist dedicated to medieval peasantry, and this year I made a video that was essentially about, I could even tell you now, about how charters were issued by lords, even sort of functionalizing a better rule of the peasants by granting them more liberty, by, for example, giving them more economic autonomy, whatever, depending on the circumstances. In fact, the Western system is sort of very relevant, because you understand that the feudal system did not actually stifle the development of, for example, the communal civilization per se. Right here, we're taking a broad look at the whole, but in general, the sense that we're looking at a world where the peasantry was involved actually in many local administrative and sort of land exploitation mechanisms, the fact that they contributed with significant amount of troops, and is actually pretty notorious in historiography, as much as the fact that we don't really see much peasant rabble in medieval armies, right? That's a bit of a cliche, but aside from some fringes of the world where infantry was, society was poor in general, so people approximated to peasants, and infantry in this sense was also tendentially more prevalent because the elite had less surplus, and so they couldn't even field a particularly high amount of cavalry. We've seen it for the Dittmarscher, we've seen partially with the Scandinavian communes, etc. They're more like peasants with pitchforks, etc. But all in all, right, from across Western Europe, you look at 13, 14, 17, they look all pretty much the same. You see humble rank and file infantrymen that were depicted. They do have a servilier. They even have some coat of mail, right? Very often, at least their ranks would wear them because they were given, right, for the campaign. And or also they brought this from home, depending on who they were. If they, say maybe peasants, not townsfolk, yes, but in this sense, don't think that they aggregated people with pitchforks either, right? There was all a way to properly, even feudal levies, right, at the outskirts of more developed places tended to be equipped by the lord for the sake of battle, and this was done by taking all security measures for local politics, because the reason why you go at war is obviously are more important than even some specific concerns at a point. Downing a horseman was a hell of a feat, right? We probably don't get how inspiring, how empowering, how incredible, really almost a word upside down it was for these footmen at some point to down a knight, right? When the news of the Battle of Courtrai, for example, made it around Europe, like, chronicles registered this as, it's unbelievable. This was a miracle. They don't even register as, of course, even less, this was the end of cavalry. Nobody thought of that. This is an anomaly. It's something that, in fact, continued not happening, as a matter of fact, at least in the specific places where normally this happens. It's all pretty scattered and relatively random. It happens more intensely at the beginning of the 14th century. And even for the previous centuries where we have less documentation, again, the stand of the Lombards against German knights, well, it was something really impressive, right? It was all mixed, because as we said, there was no division like a people fought as knights and other as infantry, but the fact that there had been infantrymen, there had been those guys with that role in society, was a huge deal. Even the fact that there were armies that were capable of being organized like that, the fact that the infantry was so strong, right? It was impressive for other countries to witness. At the same time, these guys were armed. They were always there. So more or less all the world functioned like this, right? Infantry wasn't precluded from existing. It was always there. Just their power individually was not particularly good for a while, at least not enough to break cavalry dominance. But this had, in fact, deeper sociocultural and political and moral reflections, especially in a great feudal hierarchy. Needless to say, and we just hinted at this throughout the whole video, urban communes in particular held a profound awareness of their collective strength. A fact recorded explicitly, for example, for the Flemish populations in the Histoire de Guillaume le Maréchal. This is an extensive Anglo-Norman biographical poem of nearly 20,000 lines composed between 1225 and 1229, at the behest of the Marshal's family to celebrate the career of the undefeated tournament champion and eventual regent of England. Right? And this is a beautiful source. I made a video about William Marshal last year. We didn't dedicate the video to tournaments per se. Just yesterday I made a video about Jacques de la Langue. As you've seen, we'll continue to talk about the entwinement between tournaments and in actual warfare that, especially early in the day, we found no actual difference, right? This is also a source that agrees with ours here. There are different sources that speak about this infantry awareness, and especially, again, in Flanders, because it was essentially the most urbanized part of Europe, at least especially with this political communal development after Italy. Similar ideas are noted identically by Thomas Gray of Heaton, Northumbrian knight and constable of Norham Castle, who began composing his chronicle while imprisoned by the Scots in Edinburgh Castle after capture in an ambush of October 1355, concerning English communal towns in the Scala Chronica. This is a unique lay-authored Anglo-Norman universal history extending to 1363 that draws heavily on the military experiences of both the author and his father. Now, this is extremely interesting, not just because the sort of context of the Anglo-Scottish border warfare, etc., but the fact that this is a knight, first of all. We're in the second half, in the mid-14th century, but we definitely appreciate, in fact, a knight talking about communes, and you don't even hear too much about the English communes in terms of infantry capacity throughout the Middle Ages. As a matter of fact, I made some videos about this, especially for the 12th, 13th century. The English peasantry, this is not the communes that are better, but they were pretty tightly regulated, right? England, outside of London, does not really have much of a great communal phenomenon, differently from, for example, from France, even from Spain. But this tells you, in fact, how reliable this militia, this communal militia could be as well. We're talking infantrymen at large. Remember that communes always have knights, right? There are people living with a house in the town that are also, in fact, noblemen, right? And this is pretty much the case. They also control the place. The English have a very down the line control, right? Barons, it's not like in France where there are some third estate or royal officials that are put at the head of different communities across this immense. England is smaller, and barons also have more political leverage, especially since 1215 in the institutional system of the kingdom, and they basically administered the thing on their own, right? You have these communes being fundamentally controlled by them, and so the cavalry there is at the head as well. But infantry is appreciated exactly by one of these knights. By the way, northern England, which is even a less developed area than the south. Speaking before William Marshal, we're looking at also the most famous, at least I mentioned, just given that there is a biographical source that we addressed that is very important for our understanding of his life. He had been born around 1146 or 1147. As the younger son of a minor Wiltshire landholder named John Marshal, he rose through tournament success, mostly on the circuits of northern France. where this activity was the most advanced, in royal service under Henry II, Richard I, and John, whom he buried all, by the way, holding. So the matter, we've seen it also in the video about the First Baron's War. He had really a towering authority in the kingdom, right? And he sort of allowed for the reign of Henry III to more successfully usher in. He became the first Earl of Pembroke through marriage to Isabel de Clare, and after John's death in October 1216, guardian, in fact, the 9-year-old Henry III, being de facto the effective ruler of England until his own death in May 1219. So this guy is notoriously considered, at least by these sources as well, like the greatest knight in the Middle Ages, especially as far as his tournament career is concerned. Naturally, there were many other great knights that sort of didn't have this fame or fortune, but indeed the fact that he was also so powerful and capable, models, as also in his beautiful sepulchral effigy, together with one of his sons at the Temple Church. They incarnate the idea of the Visots, right? The idea of the wise man, not much like the wolf of the war band pack, but the leader, the guy who sort of mediates, in fact, with heaven, with the universal, right? Look at the tomb of Henry III, how these sovereigns also considered power. A truly imperial Catholic traditional one, as we were talking about before. And he was a Templar. So we explained before what these men did for a living. But the poem about him that we cited, now we will keep perhaps really drawing information from it. It was written in octosyllabic couplets by a professional troubadour, known only as John. It preserves detailed recollections of tournament circuits stretching from the Ile-de-France to the Low Countries. This, together with England, were very core, properly knightly, chivalric, feudal countries. It's the heart of what we see, of we think as the Middle Ages, right? Especially in the 19th century revival that came, and surprisingly also from these countries at the time were the most advanced, and also at this point, also in terms of feudal monarchic power, they also were, right? England at some point in history started lagging behind again, but overall, it preserved also its aura for a reason. There is a lot of cross-channel diplomacy during the Angevin Capetian struggles that we also recently made some video on. In the 1216-1217 civil war against the baronial rebels who were saying before after their French allies under Prince Louis, right? It was technically elected as King of England, but there was no crown there, and this is the future Henry VIII of France. Like Henry the Lion also made a video biography about him. Whereas Thomas Gray's Scala Chronica, composed in Anglo-Norman prose, is one of the few 14th century English chronicles written by a lay, fighting man, rather than a cleric. There were, as this shows, there was a bit more of modern secular outlook on things at this point in history. The crisis brings to the, rather than fighting, to writing at some point. But these men were indeed part of the military business, as evidenced by the same story. And they, in fact, really speak from a very different angle, but paradoxically, an even more enamored one. Let's say one that shows you how the crudity of war was combined still with actual ideals. Right. This is the topic for yet another video about this psychological aspects and that's of cultural and anthropological ones of medieval warfare. Gray's father had served under Edward I in the Scottish Wars of the 1290s. And early 1300s, and the son's own capture near Norham in 1355 during a Scottish raid gave him access to Scottish oral traditions that he later integrated into his narrative of the Anglo-Scottish Wars from the reign of Edward I through the early years of Edward III. We don't have a series about the Scottish Wars of Independence. I talk a bit about Edward I. I have an entire series dedicated to him, his reign, so the wars, the conquest of Wales, the wars with Scotland, initially de facto conquest of Scotland that didn't end well in any case. I recently made more videos about Edward III, also the beginning of the 100 Years' War, some reference also to the Scottish front. So that's where we'll also have to draw an overwhelming amount of of food for thought from. I really make many videos about the Scottish Wars, so-called Scottish Wars of Independence. Very far from the incredibly modern and squalidly modernistic and secularistic sort of anti-elite, anti-quality, anti-beauty feeling that the knights would have been this bunch of idiots that went against infantry just to be butchered because they were so overconfident and haughty. This is what lesser people from the 19th to 20th century in a post-traditional world made up to make you believe that you're normal the way you are as a person. If of a person we can't talk. It was actually the infantry that, through the sources, actually shows a certain vanity regarding their physical power, for example, defensive equipment and tactical arrays, frequently propelling them into the rash conduct characteristic of inexperienced recruits who had not yet learned the discipline of holding formation under pressure. Right? This is not to say that these forces, we just said it, weren't powerful or weren't impressive, or they didn't kill knights, or that they didn't end up being useful, right? That's how armies worked. But, right, we are told, these are admittedly, again, more feudal sources, but we're definitely told that the true, properly, vanity, right, vanity is character. Say, vanity comes from the Vanen, right? It comes literally from the chthonic deities. It comes from the children of the nether world. It comes from the peasantry, from the fourth estate, the Pelasgians, the nether worlders really meant. And so what do these people do? They are vain, right? They're emotional. They praise just physical power without intelligence, fundamentally. They mostly boast, oh, look, I have this, in a materialistic sense, I have an armor piece or whatever. Like, here I'm well equipped, whatever. So hoping that alone would make it, or at least, of course, they had other capacities. They knew how to beat people, so to say. But in order to win battles and wars, like, they're lively militias. They do not really know what's going on, and especially from an individual point of view. And at times, they're bold and even crazy. We've seen before the Bolognese that were probably the very peak of 13th century infantry quality, at least in relative terms to cavalry. We don't see any other comparable display of such impulsiveness, right? But in that case, at least they were up to it, right? They risked it, but that was also a political message. It was showing the knights that if they wanted, they could go out there alone. And they were challenging, in fact, the same knightly ego, meaning, you know, these footmen, these lesser people actually go at war sort of before us. You know, this is so insane. It also shows it's part of a very important political and social tension that eventually turns into military quality. An advanced civilization is not a static civilization, right? It's one that always wrestles between these elements and that is able, however, to finally harness and follow them. Indeed, these footmen were given a chance, even again in a world of feudal dominance at large, to show they're in any case knightly. Even in the communes, again, it's the knights that rule, right? Most of the time, the Flemish cities are rather towns, so they're mostly just third-estaters. They can detach themselves from their feudal overlords that live all around in the castles, but it's different from sort of more organic city-state, where you have an actual army with cavalry, infantry, whatever. Now, such premature impulsiveness of the infantry first appears and here we're talking mostly, unless I point out the exception, commoners, right? Say infantry as footmen as commoners, right? Not dismounted knights. There is also that. Some people will talk about this. There's plenty of that, as a matter of fact, especially in the previous century. But here we're talking about the commoners. And their impulsiveness is among sort of the first accounts appearing in the historical record of Brabant's communal forces at Gulpen. It was a strategic locality in the Overmaas region, contested during the Limburg succession struggle in 1284, which is a year in which there is really a lot of interesting things going on, especially in places like Brabant, and the broader, say, Limburg is bordering, again, Flemish infantry in a broader sense, not just the third estators of the major Ghent, Jeppe, and Brugge, but also this peasant feudal interland, right, has its own thing to say, right? What is fascinating about this is that there was a part of Europe that was sort of savager in a sense. We're talking mostly the northern part, or the non-post-Roman parts. Like in part also England behaves like this, but we're talking mostly Germany, right? These are countries that arrive a bit later, right? They have this wave of expansion that, when activating, like at this point in medieval civilization, does, and given that it was less surplus, does give you the idea that infantry, in this sense, had a potential because they were a bit more, say, communally aware of sort of the fact that feudal authority in this northwestern German areas was scarcer, right? So infantry matters here, right? And they're also pretty brutal people because in general they're fairly primitive, right? They are pretty newcomers to civilization in a way, so they have this forces to spend still. And in this case, infantry, this strife, it's complicated, or sort of bishops, counts fighting each other, communes, and whatever. The infantry's eagerness demanded immediate battle. It's the infantry that asked for it, right? Until Duke John I, known as the Victorious, who ruled Brabant from 1267 and later secured Limburg after the crushing engagement at Waringen, that we will be looking at soon, in fact, 4 years later, 1288, intervened to restrain their thirst for combat. Jan van Helu, a contemporary Brabantine rhyming chronicler whose detailed verse account focuses primarily on the campaigns, culminating in that later triumph, documents this. Right, I'm using this as a source where I don't think we need to properly read it. At some point, we could make an entire video about these passages. But for telling you, now we'll be citing him a little bit, how consistent these episodes were, right? Literally, infantry wanting to go at war, right? Becoming anxious. This was not really a positive indication. It was historically both cavalry and infantry, the more nervous, the more anxious, that did not know how to hold their nerves, right? They wanted to arrive to come to grip with the enemy because it's like, I don't know, the World War I effect, like, you feel better while finally rushing over the top than in between, like waiting for death. It was better just to cope with what was coming. And this is really the pressures that kind of existed here. You may understand them definitely in a different sense, but don't think that there were simple matters, right? You're more likely destiny, if your host was broken, was to be cut down by one of those terrible knights, or their retinue men, raiders, and so on. The Limburg succession crisis began in 1283. After the death without male heirs of Duchess Ermengarde, last of the native house of Limburg. Rival claims by Adolf of Berg, Reinald of Gelders, and John of Brabant, supported by different regional coalitions of local lords and urban contingents, turned Meuse Valley into a theater of intermittent warfare until the Battle of Waringen on June 5, 1288, fixed Brabantine control over the duchy and its vital river crossings. Jan van Helu was a cleric attached to the Brabantine court. At the time, he composed his rhymed chronicle in Middle Dutch shortly after the events, giving particular attention to the composition of urban contingents drawn from the craft guilds of Brussels, Leuven, and other Brabantine towns, and the personal intervention of the Duke, who rode among the ranks to impose order, as we said before, right? Also against what will happen in 10 years further west, like the Flemish revolt against the French. It was knights who disciplined this infantry, who lined them up, who properly deployed them in the right terrain, who told them what to do, how to organize ranks, right? This was also relatively noble. Up to a few generations ago, this men were sort of kicked in the teeth, like, yes, where they were used for combat, but knights were a bit more unchallengedly and very disagreeably in charge, right? And not being, not wasting time with peasants, so to say, in their ranks. Now, these communities have more to offer, especially third estates of the communal centers. And so they start using them more actively. They understand that, of course, in this very bitter fights, that these resources are important. You have to win over the population as well for new conquests. Likewise, the inhabitants of Maastricht, a key Meuse-crossing city whose walls and stone bridge repeatedly figured in local hostilities, and which jointly governed by the Prince Bishop of Liège and the Duke of Brabant under a long-standing condominium arrangement, controlled the principal stone bridge over the lower Meuse and therefore functioned as a recurring prize in every overmass clash, fell into the trap set by Walram of Valkenburg, also called Walram the Red, a vigorous lord of Valkenburg and Monschau, noted for the aggressive raids and later service in the Franco-Flemish clashes, in fact, of the early 14th century. Understand how cosmopolitan knightly experience also was. And this family held scattered lordships along the Meuse and in the Eifel hills, and who specialized in rapid mounted forays designed to provoke precisely the sort of undisciplined civic sorties described by Van Helu. He merely showed himself beyond the ramparts with a small mounted force, prompting guild members to seize weapons and rush out foolishly without waiting for proper array, so that even though Bailiff John of Mill brought a small mounted escort of Brabantine knights, Walram's troops crushed them in open ground, and the victorious lord numerous captives among the townsmen. Right? It's a very interesting clash at the end of the 13th century in Flanders. Right? We have something similar 20 years later at the Battle of Pontetetto, just outside of Lucca. Essentially, the peasant condottiero Uguccione della Faggiola started plundering the Lucchese countryside. This was a wealth possession, and he provoked battle with some Lucchese cavalry wings at the crossings at the fording of Pontetetto on the Serchio River, just some few kilometers outside of Lucca. It's at that point that he lured basically the Lucchese forces, cavalry, but also a lot of infantry outside, marching a bit like this, without realizing this was an ambush. And he actually had hidden cavalry in the flank and carried out a massacre in front of the foregate of the city. There's some very interesting circumstances of hastily put together troops that were crushed so easily. And naturally, the more infantry there was, the easier it was to especially catch them by surprise in some way. A couple of years later, at the Battle of Montecatini, for example, even the incredibly well-orderly host of the Prince of Taranto, these were wealth Angevin troops, like was probably the largest army of the time, 30,000 men. Well, the battle lines at large marched with a lower guard. They thought their enemy was withdrawing. Instead, they had ambushed them as well under the same Guccione, by the way. They had taken a habit for this. And aside from the incredibly complex tactics that was enacted there to attack them again with combined arm tactics, attacked from the flank and so on, it seems that, for example, the crossbowmen traveled with their weapons loaded on wagons, right? And it was so hot in that summer, 1315, that knights themselves apparently despoiled themselves of their armor, in part at least. Just for telling you how these were sort of broader moral, psychological ruses set as traps to have the same effect for both cavalry and infantry. But infantry, especially a leaderless one, so without knights in particular, was a much easier one to sort of lure outside. Not always, because throughout the Middle Ages, indeed, fortified enclosures had always provided with a pretty sound level of security, and actually infantry was best at defending this outpost. And very often were also defending their own towns, their own houses. And so there is all a history of siege warfare. We should actually make more episodes about that. I think would be in fact much more putting things much more in perspective. And though siege warfare is slightly less documented in the details, like there is not much of a tactical dynamism there, really chronicles care. In open field confrontations, you find all these phases. Siege warfare is a bit more complicated. You can have sorties, you can have whatever, but after all, it's all very repetitive. And that's also why it sort of makes it less in the news or in pop culture as well. This is at least understandable in part, but it's not like it was less important. Also because most battles were actually triggered by sieges as well outside the fortifications. In 1128, let's stick to Flemish examples because there is a rich, fairly, again, for the times and places, abundance of sources regarding Flanders. Given exactly that third estate development that was occurring in the region at this point, that provides us with more literary evidence. Even though it was fairly simple as well, most of these sources we've seen could also be courtly. But the fact that we're closer to also the communal world did influence them in this more prolific sense. And in fact, in 1128, the men of Bruges, or Brugge if you prefer, marched to Oostkamp, a settlement south of the city that served as a focal point for relief operations during the succession crisis, to relieve in Flanders, to relieve an ally besieged by Count William Clito. This is a very famous sort of context. We covered it in different episodes, especially French warfare. William Clito was, in fact, the son of the dispossessed Robert Curthose and briefly Count of Flanders in 1127-28 under the sponsorship of Louis VI of France before his mortal wounding near Aalst. Yet the instant they sighted opposing knights, they wheeled about and fled headlong. Right, the fact that they wheeled about is a reference also to the actual maneuvers that they could enact. Like infantry was absolutely capable of doing any kind of maneuver, right? There isn't a scene in which, I don't know, infantry was lined up for battle and they didn't know how to reline up, right? They would be ordered by knights. They had some head of the people themselves that knew how to do the stuff on a regular basis. They marched in column. They knew how to deploy in line, switching to formations. They wheeled about. That's very interesting. This was being down, there was all an inner cohesion and minimal training for carrying it out, but it was also normal for any infantry formation, right? But this does not make it in any case because cavalry chases them and hunts them down. Returning in July of the same year to attempt once more the relief of a nice fortified manor under siege of William Clito, infantry panicked on the sixth day when William launched a fierce assault with his household knights and sprinted home, spreading terror among the suburban population who also fled toward the city with cattle and household goods, so that Bruges itself became so petrified that no one slept that night, apparently, while the truth of the rout remained unspoken, lest a gloomy outlook invite charges of treason or sympathy for William Clito. And this comes from Galbert, a notary of Bruges, an eyewitness whose day-by-day Latin narrative of the murder of Charles the Good and the ensuing civil war remains the principal contemporary record. The information is quite interesting because you see how knights can do practically everything. That they are the crack force that can engage in infantry in open field, in some fortified context. They can storm towns, like in this case. So there are all strategic balances for which this can or can't happen, of course. But knights are really protagonists of all this. At the early 12th century is a pretty good example of this. And this was an area where infantry was also relatively relevant, right? Telling the truth, I mean, we're very close to the same Hastings. I mean, this was essentially 3 generations before. But I mean, if you think about the resistance of the Anglo-Danes, right? And the general character of these Germanic populations, like you have an idea of the overall potential infantry had. Like there's something very interesting. Like knights were sort of less in charge of the battlefield as mounted forces until the mid 12th century. So not that far away. Mounted cavalry at this point is already very, very advanced, to say the least. But there is also the sense that they truly are something else compared to these other commoners, in ways that are sort of difficult to reconcile. We, perhaps with, again, the notion that infantry in the previous centuries simply equated to sort of more freemen. No, they were just more sort of commoners and less knights, probably as a hyper elite, right? And so the same knights often dismounted to fight, is especially true in Northern Europe, in Central Europe, etc. And so this is a good example of what could happen when, however, knights were still pretty darn aggressive. And in these areas, if you look at William Clito himself, I mean, the whole also West Frankish background of the nobility, you realize that we're talking also the most advanced knightly culture out there. William Clito was born in 1102 as the only legitimate son of Robert Curthose, Duke of Normandy. Had been excluded from the Anglo-Norman succession by his uncle Henry I after the Battle of Tinchebray in 1106. So you see, at that point, for example, Normandy, compared to the rest of France, had a bit more of infantry bias, because the Norse that had settled there historically, and same Normandy, were a bit less developed overall. And so they would also tendentially dismount. Even doesn't matter how strong Norman knights were, in many ways, once you are engulfed with many lands like England's or Sicily's, or Antioch's for that matter, you definitely are something big and important. So I'm not claiming here that we're not in front of the Western culture, but we're talking even about knights that come from a pinch less within this Western knighthood, a bit less mounted proclivity, right? If you look at the Midlands, Northern England, you realize that the South was also a bit more sort of identical to this, in fact, Western Frankish culture. But there was this overall foot bias, not because of any preferential style, but just because of greater sort of primitivity, less resources, rather than some, again, strange cultural inclination. There is always an explanation. And here in Flanders, they performed that well. They terrorized the population. We will never fully appreciate how terrifying, truly in an inferic sense, an early 12th century knight had to be in the mentality of a contemporary Flemish burgher, right? There's much continuity also from the predations of previous centuries of the Norse, etc. After the murder of Count Charles the Good of Flanders in the Church of Saint Donation at Bruges in March 1127, Louis VI of France installed Clito as count in order to create a counterweight to English influence along the Channel coast, but Clito's short rule ended when he was mortally wounded, as we've seen in a skirmish near Aalst in July 1128, while attempting to suppress local opposition. It's a very interesting figure. We will surely make a video about him. If you're interested in the videos in which I talk about Louis VI, there is in fact like copious. It was a very sort of crucial part of his policy, right? The support of Clito against the Normans. Galbert of Bruges, we mentioned the source, was a notary, in particular in the service of the Count's administration, right? He produced this uniquely detailed Latin diary covering the period from the murder through the restoration of Thierry of Alsace. His account preserves the exact sequence of civic masters called by the bells of the belfry, the psychology of panic that sees men unused to facing mounted charges in the open, and the political atmosphere inside the city walls where fear of treason accusations silenced public discussion of military failure. When the Commune of Cambrai rose against its bishop and burgrave in 1138, those leaders sought aid from Thierry of Alsace, Count of Flanders, the eventual victor of the 1127-28 succession struggle, who ruled the country, in fact, for 4 decades until 1168. right? Very, very important figure, restoring comital authority while granting carefully limited privileges to the major towns of Ghent, Bruges, and Ypres in exchange for military service and financial aid, who sent his constable Michael of Harn to suppress the rebels. One day, the insurgents marched out with horns and banners to attack the fortress of Crèvecoeur, whereupon Michael raced from Lecluse with a small detachment of Flemish knights, charged the citizens in tight formations of lance and shield, routed them at once, and inflicted roughly 90 fatalities together with 300 captives. This is a great victory for the 12th century. We're told this by Lambertus de Waterloo's, the Annales Cameracenses. This gives you an idea, so quantitatively speaking, these were relatively small clashes, right, in absolute terms. But for the times and places were very relevant, and the fact that it could be 90 people killed gives you an idea of what we were talking about before. The captives were just an act of grace there. Michael of Arn belonged to a family of hereditary Flemish castellans whose members repeatedly appeared as military officers in the mid-12th century. So they were the guys in charge, as we were saying before, down the line, right, in these lands, holding the office of constable that enabled them to lead the count's household troops in the field. The Annales Cameracenses, compiled by the local cleric Lambert of Waterloo, remain thus the principal narrative source for the internal upheavals of the Cambrésis in this period, recording both the civic rebellion and the swift restoration of episcopal and comital control through knightly intervention, which was indeed also an early episode. This historical tension between Flemish communes and Flemish feudal, comital authority. The county of Flanders as a whole, again, there were many counties, but this had grown to be a true principality, right? And it was the most important part of the Low Countries. So long as infantry remained unseasoned, they proved ineffective against knights and were easily broken by armored cavalry charges that exploited gaps in their ranks. I'm undecided whether to continue the video because this is very long at this point. I would have to get into the Battle of Courtrai here, and I'm pondering whether we can perhaps go a bit on. Well, maybe, yeah. So, if anything, we'll continue in a second part. At Courtrai, we mentioned it before, the engagement of July 11th, 1302, later celebrated as the Battle of the Golden Spurs because of the numerous pairs of gilt spurs taken from fallen French knights and hung as trophies in the Church of Our Lady at Courtrai. The Flemish experienced profound terror before the clash as well. So even victorious infantry at the end of the day, they had really felt like the scare. They had, as we said before, actually been broken through by French knights. And also, important noblemen had died in the first ranks exactly to give the example, right? To really be the first ones to be tied to the entire cause as Counts of Flanders. With escape routes blocked by the River Lys and the enemy advancing across the marshy ground, the same infantry confessed their sins on the spot to the priests who accompanied the army. This was admittedly normal. It had been carried also by the other side before battle. This was normally happen. In this case, the infantry pressed shoulder to shoulder to form a living barrier of pikes and gun dags in the posterior ranks, able to withstand the ordeal. We're well told there are different sources. Veltem, the Brabantine cleric Lodewijk van Veltem, was continuation of the Spiegel Historial Surprise, vivid contemporary detail on the Flemish campaigns. In fact, I made a video about the Battle of Courtrai, and there we go by primary sources. But we'll come back on the battle because, of course, it's so relevant. We still haven't made... I think we made only one video about the Battle of Courtrai, which is insane. About Bouvines, we already have like 3-4 videos or something. But we'll routinely come back to Courtrai because it's such a simple battle, after all. It's what we were saying before. This army is also, how many do you think that the Flemish were? This major battle. By the way, the early 14th century, estimate Verbruggen states like between 11,000. There isn't much there to dig, right? You can spend a profitably large amount of time looking at the sources of the battle and everything, but overall, it's also a relatively simple engagement. Complex in its own, obviously, tactical relevance, but still, from the sources and so on. But overall, it's a pretty obvious. But as von Clausewitz says, war is actually simple. The bigger the engagement, actually, it's a bit difficult. Things can be overly complicated because the odds tend to balance. It's sort of just you can't do simpler things with more men. During the opening impact, certain terrified recruits from the flank of Bruges broke ranks under the 1st French cavalry probe, and later, when the Count of Artois attacked while French rear elements advanced, panic broke out among Guy of Nemours' forces. The second son of the Count, Guy of Dampierre, who had helped organize the Matin of Bruges and later commanded Flemish naval forces at XII-XIV, while by the end of the engagement, the French infantry themselves bolted in terror. Now, this is interesting because, by the way, these guys had been fighting and would keep fighting in the ensuing years in different, typically feudal battles and fighting as Counts of Flanders, also typical feudal knights, right? Guy of Dampierre actually was in southern Italy. He was a vassal of the King of Naples, as a matter of fact, and the Florentine chronicler Villani tells us literally that he abandoned this rich, estates in the south to rush to Flanders to basically support his people. That's how they had ended up like riding the wave of this third estate revolt. Flanders will not really win the war either, right? The Franco-Flemish War ends badly for them, and then there is a general decline. Made multiple videos also from a strictly political and social point of view. It tells you what these communes reasoned like, especially as bourgeois towns. It wasn't this extraordinary success. I mean, Courtrai was an extraordinary success, to say the least, and again, a great shocker for the world, because the flower French cavalry was literally massacred. But they were not in this battle. But overall, consider what we said before regarding the fact that these are sort of spurs of communal force in Flanders, rather than something organic, integral, truly field armies, self-sustained. They would never achieve that historically. This is interesting as well, because another very important trait of infantry psychology is that the commoners were pretty evil. Like, we're told that peasants in particular were particularly ferocious, bloody, like monstrous, violent, rough, immoral, and despicable individuals. This is not just the feudal sources telling us; it's telling us. We're told about that from the actual failure of their own endeavors during the Jacquerie. They had their historical chance, their civilizational chance to earn a seat in the parliament as the fourth estate, and they failed badly because they had no broader consciousness themselves. Normally, these revolutions always ended badly for the whole community, right? You never find any of these revolutions where people actually got better in the end, right? There was always some degradation of the higher level of authority, with worse people in charge and messier situation, and people at the bottom especially paying the most for it. But for this very reason, there was a greater frustration, especially among the fourth estaters, right? There were many motivations. There had been all a history of anti-knightly, anti-comital, anti-episcopal, anti-feudal authority push. Thinking about the Brabançon, thinking about how also this had aligned with the Cathars in the previous centuries. There was, in that sense, a class struggle. In that sense, as social instances where, you had to, as the elite, you had to keep the order, because otherwise these people would have taken over, and quite brutally so, quite obviously, quite often blindly so. And we see how short-sighted they were politically. As also the third and fourth estaters in the Flemish communes, we've seen it in the crisis. They essentially collapsed their own economy in the mid-14th century, reduced them to some subjects, in fact, of Valois-Burgundy in the end. It's really not a positive story at all. It's something terrible, telling the truth. This happens more or less all across Europe. There are lots of wars that play as catalysts. here the infantry are often anonymous, like nobody remembers much the names of these commoners, whatever. But you want to appreciate at least that part of this violence, part of this hatred, right? Remember primordial hatred is the third part of the Clausewitzian Trinity, in fact, is identified in the people, is actually necessary, right? These systems were pretty primitive. So actually it constituted a very core part of their force, because that's mostly all like they had. Like these were people also that had never really wielded a weapon in any meaningfully sort of skill sense up to the day before. In fact, they wouldn't even. All these tactics, the way the ranks were formed, mostly knights took care of that, and they were actually broken by the French. And that's why also the knights had prepared a reserve of infantry behind the phalanx, because they knew that this would have likely been broken. Right, so they were the first ones who actually correctly predicted what would have happened, because they probably had some sort of, by sheer experience and practice, some sort of mathematical knowledge of how this would go. I mean, they couldn't simply know, but they had a sense by sort of eyeballing the tactical scenario that likely the French would have broken through, because the French were pretty darn good. And actually, the Battle of the Golden Sports, it shows you how great the French were in managing to break such heavily defensive position against so many troops, in spite of also the limitation that they had themselves. Some say the mistakes of charging in without harassing them, or crossbows, we'll never know. But the knights successfully did what they had to do. The Battle of the Golden Sports is something, again, incredibly interesting. It was fought on the marshy ground east of Courtrai that was being besieged. There was a French garrison inside, pro-French garrison inside, after the Flemish urban militias had already seized the town and its citadel in a night assault, by the way. I said that it had been besieged because there was this castle holding out with this enemy garrison inside, so that was very much like the whole point of the siege still. As long as that force remained there, also the Flemish had to basically stay there, otherwise the French would have sort of resupplied it. So this is incredibly sort of relevant also for telling you how few could really hold against so many, right? And in fact, the French garrison sortied out of the fortress during the battle as well, trying to sort of break further the Flemish host. Lodewijk van Velthem, a Brabantine Augustinian canon, continued Jacob van Maerland's Middle Dutch World Chronicle and devoted extensive attention to the events of 1302-1304. Drawing on, so there's Montpevel, there is all a set of interesting battles as well between infantrymen, right, including the local chronicles say Spanish and Italian forces. We know better from the Tuscan ones that there were actually Lombards and Tuscans had been hired by Philip IV to counter, in fact, these Flemish forces, especially after Courtrai. And apparently the pikemen of Italy were deeply impressed at the Flemish. At some point, there is a Flemish chronicle that says in the 15th century that even Castracani, that I made a video on last month, was among these forces as well, just for telling you, which is likely, right, even though we were never fully sure, but for telling you how much these countries also knew about each other's military events and leaders, and sort of how prestige even that naming that presence would have added. And we know, by the way, that the Italians extrapolate themselves pretty well at the siege of Tournai from the mass of the Flemish. And so you want to appreciate especially the difference between the Flemish and the Italians in all this, because actually the latter were far more advanced, but in pop culture, the Flemish gets sort of greater recognition because, again, of the military revolution and some other cultural reasons, and the idea that everything started at this, and there is no sense of how different military systems were advanced. I mean, even the French had good infantry. Did the Flemish have sort of this great infantry compared to the French? Not really, apparently. Maybe they were more driven. This is true, but say in qualitative terms, in terms of organization, maybe, but it's not even sure. There isn't this radical, essential difference. They were pretty similar with one another. There were lots of pretty large French communes, for that matter. And French infantry is really underrated, I think, especially during the 13th century. We'll have to make some videos also in the military historical unit about it. And Ludovic draws on informant present at the campaign who described this dense hedgehog formations, the role of the Godendag. Actually, it was Gepin de Stave. This was the actual name, which means point to stick, literally. Point to state. There's a heavy, but there is all a question. There's the Oxford chest just describing. We'll make a video about that. I made a video about bludgeoning weapons that explains part of that, but we'll also make a video about the Flemish infantrymen of this era. Godendag meaning good morning, really. It's a heavy wooden staff tipped with an iron spike, apparently could both thrust and club, interestingly enough. They were this multitask weapons. They had actually a relatively sophisticated, for non-professional troops, right, fairly multifunctional capacity. In this case, was more deriving from, again, pretty rough means, right? But for example, the halberds will develop at some point 3 or 4 distinct functions, right? Cutting, piercing, breaking, and even with a back cut. This was especially the Italian halberd that could, when pulling back, the weapon could cut a horse's hoof. This is similar to the Chinese halberds as well, you see in the Far East, but for telling you how actually similar weapons are across the world. Those are very great distances. For the same purposes, by the way. Guy of Namur was the younger son of the imprisoned Count Guy of Dampierre. It had emerged as one of the principal field commanders of the Flemish revolt after the Matin of Bruges in May 1302, when the townsmen massacred the French garrison inside the city. That was also an interesting scenario where infantrymen felt confident enough to take on cavalry, because of course the latter could not fully deploy in the narrow city streets, and so it could cut them to pieces. Dante remembers in the 30 years before the massacre of Forlì, carried out by the famous Ghibelline Romagnol leader Guido de Montefeltro, would end up, in fact, fundamental reform. The peasant army was one of the most effective ones, possibly the most tactically advanced of the era in general, because, again, it was easy to ambush these guys in the city streets. And there's plenty of, especially in the bigger cities in Europe, of these instances where the people would successfully take on knights and win. That was basically the only place where this could happen. But it was still a big deal. Like, we tend not to recount that because it's I don't know why scholars said, okay, well, but it's in a city, it doesn't matter. Actually, some city battles were pretty massive. There's the one of Rome in 1312 with Henry VII going there. It's literally the largest urban battle in the Middle Ages. There are others later on where you see infantry taking on cavalry successfully in the sort of constricted spaces of the urban landscape. So also deployed as actual formations, actual battle lines. That's the interesting part as well, where space allowed. So there is all a subterranean aspect or urban aspect of medieval warfare that I suspect has not been adequately covered. Gilles Le Musy, abbot of Saint-Martin in Tournai, later compiled an independent Latin chronicle that likewise records the panic phases of the engagement and the subsequent recovery of Flemish morale once the French knights were unhorsed in the mud. The same phenomenon reappeared 2 years later, near the village of Monin-Pavel, at the close of the battle, when fatigued and the arrival of French reserves again tested the cohesion of the Flemish ranks. Right, you have essentially Philip IV almost killed by a Flemish infantryman. One of his own regiment actually kneeled to have him jump on horseback and flee, and this guy got beheaded in Philip IV's stead. We also have Philip's armor, the battle, and basically, so what had happened is the Flemish had, as we were saying at the beginning of the video, deployed in a defensive position. The French had attacked, and they had failed to break through. Monin-Pavel is also somehow more interesting because there are plenty of these battles in early Swiss warfare where, there is actually some frontal clash, and the infantry actually manages to repel. Yeah, but what do the Flemish do? They actually break the line. They break the formation. They pursue the French. The French regroup and they launch a counter-strike and they massacre them. So it ends up in a stalemate, but it tells you how vulnerable and incomplete indeed a mono-arm host really was. The Flemish was just very, very driven, so they were very morally loaded. But that's all they had. Right, they were incredibly limited from a military point of view. They could basically just defend, not even to, in fact, settle the matter. That's the problem in many circumstances. We've seen it also among the English during the 100 Years' War. As long as they remained dismounted also in the major engagements, they never fully chased how many enemies that they really could. Sometimes, like at Azincourt, they didn't even have enough men to maintain the prisoners they had seized. And they actually killed them in that circumstance. Now, in 1213, the infantry, it's because Flanders, again, has, before the early 14th century, all this preparation, so to say, of different clashes in which infantry had toyed with the idea of taking on the knights, right? In 1230, but they had also suffered from those blows. I made, again, an entire series about the Burgundian warfare, Valois-Burgundian warfare, showing all, in fact, and we'll make separate videos about each. All the various defeats of the Flemish, as we're saying, in the 14th and 15th century at their hand. So it's as if this strain of clashes had been going on forever, really, right, between infantry and cavalry in Flanders. In 1213, the infantry of the Count of Luz, Louis II, whose contingent formed the right wing of the Liégeois army, scattered early at the Battle of Steps, fought on October the 13th near Montenaken between the forces of Bishop Hugh of Pierrepont of Liège and the Duke Henry I of Brabant over the succession to the county of Mons under the mistaken belief that their lord had fallen and the field was lost. The Battle of Steps decided the contest for the small but strategically placed county of Mohave, whose castles controlled key approaches to the Meuse Valley. Louis II of Luz, whose territory lay between the Meuse and the Demer rivers, brought a substantial infantry contingent drawn from his rural tenants that collapsed when false reports of his death circulated through the ranks, allowing the Brabantine cavalry to roll up the Liégeois line and secure a crushing victory for the Duke Henry I. I mean, hell, even the Norman army at Hastings had been almost broken by the fake news that Duke William had been killed. Right, so this is somehow normal, and what you want to appreciate here is that even the rural tenants up to that point had been engaged into hand-to-hand combat against this other tactically complete forces, and that it's only this sort of incident that makes them collapse. Admittedly, they had probably been shaken in this new sort of were the last strength, so to say, to make them collapse. But still, you want to appreciate they were just rural tenants that they had been holding the line. Right, so don't underestimate how potentially eager this possessed masses of medieval Europe really were once properly cowed into battle and sort of given a reason and sort of proper instructions to fight, to stand their ground at least. This was again very inspiring for them. It was very redeeming, right? It was something that the feudal system of the time would not allow, because otherwise there would have not been that knightly dominance either. And so everything is balanced for reasons now we're not going to digress on, because these videos are already long the way they are. But still, they were a relevant tactical element, and they some of them lived to tell the tale of what infantry could do, right? On the night of March the 20th to the 21st, 1304, so we're back to the Franco-Flemish War. Zeelanders and Flemings under Guy of Namur launched a surprise raid on Frisian and Hollander camps on the island of Duveland, a low-lying Zeeland island whose temporary camps proved vulnerable to nocturnal assault during the renewed Aven-Dampierre hostilities. Feudal matters, but you see here in this pretty sort of amphibious fringes of Europe, so to say, how intense they could be, and how much they could entail infantry capacity, especially in this tough terrain, which is something that indeed cavalry also has to cope with. In this case, chaos overwhelmed William of Aven's army, the third son of the Count of Hainaut and Holland, who was contending for control of Zeeland. So completely that Frisians and Hollanders fought one another in the darkness while others fled to the ships or sought safety inside Zierikzee, resulting in a catastrophe that cost William most of Holland and the bishopric of Utrecht. The Aven-Dampierre rivalry originated in the disputed succession to Flanders and Hainaut after the death of Margaret of Constantinople in 1280. These were sort of the Latins that had gotten their piece of land and still held titles, even as Constantinople had been retaken by the Palaiologi from the Latin Empire. Control of Zeeland, with its island and shipping lanes linking the Scheldt to the North Sea, becoming a critical secondary theater between 1303 and 1305 during the Franco-Flemish War, as both houses sought to secure the economic and strategic resources of the Delta region. This is from the opposite side of France, and of course, like the Aven, were profiting of this terrifying clash. It was tearing Flanders apart. A bit later, on the night of July the 25th to the 26th, 1340, Flemish troops south of Cassel under Robert of Artois, the disinherited French noble who had fled to England and now led an Anglo-Flemish contingent in the opening land campaign of the 100 Years' War, succumbed to unprovoked mass panic despite facing no attack and recovered discipline only far from their camp. We're told this by Jean Lebel, the Hainaut chronicler whose eyewitness-informed narrative became a principal source for later writers. And this is really interesting because it shows how dangerous it is, even just to rule a mob, a crowd, right? Robert of Artois, having lost his claim to the county of Artois through a protracted lawsuit at the French court, that ended in his condemnation for forgery and treason. It was one of the causes for the 100 Years' War, as a matter of fact. I've seen it also in the recent video about the Edwardian phase. In fact, it fled to England in 1334 and became a key advisor to Edward III, urging the English king to assert his claim to the French throne. The 1340 campaign around Cassel was intended to relieve pressure on the Anglo-Flemish alliance after the naval victory at Louis in June of that year. Pretty big clash. There had been others, like at the XII-XIV, if anything, a coastal location we mentioned later. And here, the English had crushed at sea the French Genoese fleet. Jean Lebel, we mentioned, the source was a canon of Liège, who accompanied the Hainaut contingent under John of Hainaut, basing his chronicle on direct observation and interviews with participants, providing one of the earliest independent accounts of the early 100 Years' War and the fragile morale of the Flemish levies when operating away from their home cities, in a time, by the way, that had definitely worsened after the Franco-Flemish War and the Flemish defeat, and in fact also the general shrinking of Western world and the world entire because of the mid-14th century crisis. So what triggered the Black Death as opposed to being a peaceful, happy time before that arrived, right? So we have actually the chance to talk about some other events here, and I will do so in a separated video. But I think this was interesting and enough for today. I'm going to make the other half on another day. Also, I don't know when, depending on how this video goes. If this video gets a lot of views, you share it, whatever. I'm going to do this. If you enjoyed it, of course, I'm going to do it relatively sooner because I'm going to store them. There are some thirds or halves of videos that I still have to finish from last year because there's those things like, I don't know, Eastern Iranian warfare during the Middle Ages or medieval Indian warfare that for some reason you don't watch at all. So in order to prevent lowering YouTube algorithmic average, especially this time of the year is not particularly high by himself, I'm going to be a bit more tactical about this stuff. So this video is complementary, you said before, with the one we made about the knightly combat psychology, and we are definitely going to expand further on this topic, because we really have a lot about medieval infantry warfare. We are the channel that made the most, as a matter of fact, as it is actually unsurprising. However, there's also so much to do at a general level, and I think that these are evergreens in a way or another. You never end looking at this stuff from an in-depth point of view. What I would say is, be aware of how wide the Middle Ages are. Never think that this channel is for people that just want emotionalism about, ooh, look, he talks about this place where I come from. This has nothing to do with that. It's a Teutonic superstition. It has nothing to do with the imperial Catholic tradition. Reason for which, you will have to be sort of carefully attentive as far as all this content goes, as it's part of a wall, right? You can't really separate it from the rest. There is always a lot of stuff to look at, and we're not making these videos just for some strange narrative that people like to privately cultivate, even though the channel is diametrically opposite to that as well, in a metaphysical sense. So in any case, this is it for today. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.